Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dr. Micah Kohles with Oxbow Animal Health. I also have Dr. Cayla Iske with me, who is Oxbow's nutritionist. Really excited to have everybody joining us here today. We're going to share a little presentation based on some research that Dr. Iske and myself did, looking at specifically muesli mixes or seed-based mixes, and really when we get down to the nuts and bolts nutritionally, what are those differentiating factors as we look at muesli mixes versus pelleted foods. We really want to answer questions, so please use the chat box and throw in any questions you've got along the way. We've got some time at the end opened up to answer those questions and share a discussion regarding any topics. We're also going to do a drawing at the end, so make sure that you stay around to the end so you can be involved in that drawing for $100 in free Oxbow product. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and get the presentation started. We look forward to you guys talking at the end, and Dr. Iske and I will answer questions at that stage in the game. Thanks and enjoy.
My name is Dr. Micah Kohles, and I'm a veterinarian here at Oxbow Animal Health.
And I'm Dr. Cayla Iske. I'm the nutritionist here at Oxbow Animal Health. And we're here today to talk to you about muesli mixes, which you've probably seen on the market for a long time, and specifically why they're not healthy for small mammal pets.
Yeah, and muesli mixes have really kind of been the staple of the industry for decades, as Dr. Iske alluded to. And unfortunately, they've really been gaining in popularity lately as people have added claims about foraging and enrichment, and these actually being quote unquote natural foods for small mammals.
And you might have actually heard of what are now being called foraging mixes. And this is just, again, a play on the claim that they stimulate more foraging. And we'll get into why that's not exactly true and why these mixes, whether muesli or foraging, actually have really dangerous implications for small mammal pets, and why veterinarians and nutritionists have been recommending against feeding these mixes and recommend feeding a uniform pellet, and why exactly that is, and some of the research that exists today. So today we're going to talk to you about 9 mix myths that are out there that you've probably heard about, and why they're not true, and the research that supports actually against them. So mix myth number 1 that we're going to talk about is that mixes are actually higher quality than other foods on the market.
Yeah, and the truth is that mixes do contain a diversity of ingredients. They look fun, they look nutritious, and they look healthy, but unfortunately a lot of times these diversity ingredients are actually fairly low cost and unfortunately fairly low quality.
And those low quality ingredients typically make up a larger proportion of what's actually in that bag. Yeah. And the low quality ingredients don't have those nutrients that you really need coming from a bag of food. So they're going to typically be higher in fat, starch, and sugar, but they're not going to have the added vitamins and minerals that are really the key point of these commercially available foods.
Yeah, and furthermore, we also look at a lot of these ingredients that have things such as artificial and synthetic colors and flavors and preservatives. And obviously these ingredients have no nutritional value to the animal whatsoever, are truly around marketing and perception versus actually a positive nutritional impact to the animal. So myth number 2 is that mixes will actually stimulate foraging behaviors in small pet. And obviously, as Dr. Iske alluded to, there's new products that are alluding to this foraging blend or foraging mix that are really relying heavily on this claim.
Yeah, and the truth is the foraging behavior in small mammals is extremely important. It's an instinctual behavior that they need to be able to express in your home as a pet. But unless it's done right, unless they're allowed to forage in the correct way, it's not going to have any benefit. Yeah. And these mixes, they actually don't stimulate foraging, but they encourage what's called selective feeding.
Yeah, and these animals are naturally hardwired to selectively feed as prey species. In a wild environment, that's a great survival mechanism. But when we move them into captivity and we remove a lot of those environmental stresses, the predators and so on and so forth, that type of hardwired behavior, when linked to these types of muesli mixes, actually leads to negative nutritional intake because of these selective type products.
And the reason selective feeding, or concentrate selecting it's also called, is so hardwired in these species is because it is truly a survival mechanism. So prey species, especially small herbivores in the wild, can't store a lot of food in the stomach, and that is to keep them light and keep them fast in order to escape predators. So that's why they're really going to find the most calorically dense foods so they don't have to fill up their stomach and feel full while still meeting their nutrient and energy requirements. And we're going to dig into selective feeding just a bit more because it is so important and a core reason why these muesli mixes are so unhealthy for small mammals. So we've mentioned that it is an ingrained behavior in rabbits and small herbivores in general. And so this behavior is still going to be present in your pets, just as it is a rabbit in the wild.
Yeah, and to Dr. Iske's point, rabbits have actually been shown to be the most selective of all of our exotic companion mammals, but this behavior actually applies to guinea pigs, chinchillas, and even into those omnivorous species like rats, mice, hamsters, and gerbils. Unfortunately, though, when they tie this behavior to these mixes, it oftentimes leads to them selectively feeding on the most calorically dense pieces, but a lot of times those nutritionals are also lower in fiber, higher in starch, and higher in sugars.
Yeah, and we'll show more about that in a little bit, but just to give you kind of an idea, in a mix, generally the foods that will be selected for first are things like dried fruits and vegetables, nuts and seeds, grains, and what's going to be left behind is the pelleted portion of a mix. And that's what's going to have a lot of the fiber and a lot of times all of the vitamins and minerals that your animal needs from this food.
Yeah, and unfortunately, as a pet owner, when you see that animal eating that food, you may not be able to recognize that they're truly selectively feeding for the parts they like. And either they knock the bowl over, or they tip the bowl, or mix it over, and then you end up refilling that bowl. So even though owners have a perception of that they're getting nutritionally everything that they want, that doesn't link to what actually happens in that cage. And some of the research that Dr. Iske has found has shown that upwards of 70% of rabbit owners will actually refill their pet's bowl, believing that the animal has ingested the majority of it when they've actually really just selectively fed the parts that they like.
Yep. And this is what directly leads to imbalanced nutrition through selectively feeding. And we'll talk a little bit more about the huge negative health impacts that this actually has to the pets.
All right, so myth number 3 is that mixes will help keep my pet active and spend more time feeding. And again, the truth is in the research.
Yeah, and there's actually a lot of very specific research to this point that points in the complete opposite direction. Right. So animals that were fed mixes actually led to higher levels of inactivity. So this is directly contradicting the statement that these mixes stimulate activity in your pet. And this is even worse if the mix isn't paired with loose grass hay. And then to the other point of spending more time feeding, again, a study has shown that rabbits fed a uniform pellet paired with Timothy hay spent more of their time feeding compared to rabbits fed a muesli mix and Timothy hay. So both of these points very obviously contradicted in the published research that is out there.
Yeah, and obviously our goal is to try to stimulate these animals to behave naturally. And in a wild environment, they're spending huge amounts of their day physically being stimulated and active, mentally being stimulated as they forage. And unfortunately, the research clearly shows that these foraging mixes and these seed mixes not only don't stimulate that behavior, they actually take away from that behavior, making these animals more sedentary, more not moving around their habitat, which links to so many diseases that we see in captive small mammals. All right, so myth number 4, newer foraging mixes are different than muesli mixes of old and much better for small pets. Well, unfortunately, ingredients and packaging that appear healthier and more natural, that isn't necessarily always the case. They can certainly contain other ingredients like flours and dried fruits and small amounts of loose hay. However, the truth in the research is
these small amounts, very small amounts of hay are just really not having any benefit, either nutritionally or behaviorally. The research shows that mixes that do include pieces of hay, animals will actually start selecting against that hay in preference for other pieces in the mix, which again tend to be those higher starch, higher fat, higher sugar pieces. So despite the product claims of these foraging mixes and the thought that they're any different than muesli mixes is just untrue. They'll still lead to selective feeding and still lead to an imbalanced diet.
Yeah, and furthermore, just the connection that research shows that they actually may deselect or not be incentivized to ingest the long components of hay, which we know in hindgut fermenters is so important, can just potentially exacerbate or worsen some of those common diseases we see dental-wise or GI-wise.
Myth number 5 is really getting more into the nutrition specifically of these mixes. So we've talked about selective feeding, how a majority of the time animals are going to select against those pellets that are high fiber and have vitamins and minerals. And research again has shown that rabbits will prefer grains and extruded pieces in the mix and will actually leave the pellets uneaten up to 68% of the time.
Which when you think about overall nutrition is a huge percentage, and if we see that type of behavior, that's going to lead to decreased fiber intake, potentially increase in the starch component, the fat component, the things that we know nutritionally aren't as in line with their diet. And then obviously the selectively feeding can certainly lead to changes in micronutrient intake, like vitamins and minerals. And so, as an exotic animal veterinarian and even working with nutritionists like Dr. Iske, we know very specifically that by recommending against these feeding mixes and recommending for the uniformity, we get that consistent intake. And that eliminates this variation in macronutrients and also micronutrients. So feeding a uniform, homogeneous, consistent pellet at the recommended amount is really the best way to guarantee that overall nutritional intake. All right, myth number 6. There is no evidence that mixes are bad for my small pet. The truth is that there is just a plethora of research out there that has documented and proven that mixes are unhealthy for rabbits, guinea pigs, and many of the other common exotic species.
And we've referenced a lot of those papers and a lot of that research so far. But to build on this, Oxbow really wanted to get our own data to add to this set and take a really in-depth look at the composition, the nutritional profiles, and really get our hands on some of these different muesli and foraging mixes.
Yeah, I think the key there is just differentiating marketing claims and true science, and knowing that the science validates what we know these animals nutritionally need just really empowers us to know what's correct for the animal.
Yep, so we really dug into the nutritional evaluation of these products and came up with our own process. So basically we selected 3 of the top selling mixes that are on the market today. We methodically sorted all of those out into individual components to see how much of each ingredient was in there. And then we determined out of this whole bag, how much of it is pellets, how much of it is hay, to see what you're getting when you buy these mixes. And then we analyzed each of those components individually to see what kind of nutrition they were bringing to the overall mix and the overall nutritional profile of what you're feeding your pet. And then from there, we used already published research to show, these are the percentages of different ingredients that your rabbit or small mammal is likely to consume, and how that really stacks up to the nutritional recommendations that are out there today.
And analytically, we really looked at it not only from the macro standpoint, so things like fiber and fat and protein, but even down to the micronutrient level. So really understanding the entire breadth of the nutrition that those different ingredients and the percentage bring to the actual final product. So when we actually looked at the nutritional composition, or kind of the breakdown percentage-wise of these different types of ingredients, we found some similarities across all 3 products. First of all, over 55% or greater of the overall composition was some type of uniform pellet. And then after that, about 20 to 25, upwards of 30% was a commingle of different types of grains, beans, different types of dried fruits and seeds and those types of things.
And as you can see from the graphic, those mixes that did include hay, first of all, it's very short and choppy and included in the bag at less than 1% of the total volume. So again, it's not having any nutritional benefit. No. It's not benefiting dental or gastrointestinal health. And as we've already referenced, animals will actually start selecting against it. And this all goes back to these foraging mixes and foraging claims just being untrue.
So what will the animals actually eat? What we did is we looked at literature that was published that showed what rabbits would naturally select for. And when we looked at that, they would typically ingest about 38% of the uniform pellets, upwards of 85% of more of the extruded bits, and over 90% of the grains and seeds.
And getting into the hay component of this, on average, rabbits would eat about 75% of the hay, but this was a 6-month study. And so while rabbits initially ate about 96% of that hay, after 6 months, that had declined to only about 50% of the hay. And that's where we can see that they start to select against pieces of that short, choppy hay included in mixes.
Yeah, and when we couple that to their increased ingestion of the extruded bits, the seeds, and the nuts, that all ties to that same negative nutritional profile. Lower in fiber, higher in starches, higher in fats, higher in sugars, and all those types of things that we've alluded to before.
So we used the research that defined rabbit consumption patterns and really calculated based off of what was in the bag, as you can see from this orange line of the composition of the mixes. And we used those published numbers to actually calculate what animals would be consuming from that bag. And that's what you see in the blue line. And then we reference that all back to and we use adult rabbits for this, what is their actual nutrient requirement? So fiber, you can see that while all of these mixes might contain enough fiber in the entire bag to meet the rabbit's nutrient requirement, what they're selecting for is actually falling short of that. But with a uniform complete pellet, like you can see from Oxbow, really what you see is what you get there. There's no opportunity to select select. What's in the bag is what your animal is going to be consuming. And you can see a really similar story for protein there, as they contain enough protein in the bag, but what your animal selects for is actually going to fall short of that protein requirement.
Yeah, and that same pattern in terms of tying selective eating behavior to what's in the product ties to calcium and phosphorus intake. And then when you look at starch, which is obviously something of a concern in terms of a nutrient, mixes obviously naturally have a much higher starch level with the grains and the seeds, and these are things that we know the animals really enjoy ingesting as well. Lastly, we looked at vitamin A, and vitamin A is really kind of a stakeholder that's a good reference point for most of the vitamins. And we think of that as an important factor with all micronutrients, but it's especially true with guinea pigs, knowing the requirement of vitamin C in their diet. Just because the bag itself claims an appropriate amount of vitamins, when we link that to the ingredients that provide those vitamins and tie that to the research that shows us what the animals will selectively feed, we know these animals are not consistently getting the levels of micronutrients, especially important things like vitamin A and vitamin C, that they need nutritionally.
So the seventh myth that we're going to address is that these mixes are perfectly adequate to support the health and well-being of small pets. And I think that we have shown that this is not true, but to dig into it a little bit more, these mixes impact small animal health in a variety of ways. The first one that we'll talk about is their digestive health. So many times we've talked about how these mixes lead to lower fiber and higher starch intake, and how that's really impacting the animal can be through a variety of ways. But I think some of the most important would be through gastrointestinal stasis or through dysbiosis, which is really having a negative impact on the microbiome of these pets, both of which can just wreak havoc on a small mammal's digestive system.
Yeah, and following gastrointestinal disease, probably one of the most common other disease kind of patterns that we see in small mammals is related to dental disease. And unfortunately, or I guess fortunately, there's been many research studies looking at the impact of what these animals are ingesting and the potential predilection to dental disease. Specifically looking at mixes and knowing their selective feeding behaviors, we've seen that correlative to radiographic changes that indicate early dental disease. We've actually seen that actually predisposed to true changes in the pathology, elongation of roots, changes in the actual oral pathology itself. And a couple of studies actually show that upwards of 40% of rabbits that were fed a muesli mix only had early indications of dental disease as early as 16 months later. And so we know these animals have open-rooted teeth that constantly grow throughout their entire life. We have research that links feeding muesli mixes directly to increased risk of dental pathology. There's just a really clear indication that these types of products, not only GI-wise but dental disease, just really not only set the animal up for failure, but are truly not nutritionally correct.
So myth number 8 revolves around the fact that these mixes do only make up a fraction of a small mammal's complete diet. So the thought is that if you feed other healthy foods, you provide a lot of hay, a variety of greens and veggies, that you can avoid some of these negative consequences that we've talked about. But the research shows that feeding these mix-based diets can not only stimulate selective feeding, but exacerbate it and make it worse. So these animals become even more selective in their feeding. Again, selecting against hay and for the softer pieces of that mix. And as Dr. Kohles alluded to earlier, the research actually shows that animals fed mixes consumed less hay and drank less water compared to animals fed a uniform pellet.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about the importance of fiber intake, but hydration is really equally tied to that. You know, in the wild, these animals are eating all kinds of high moisture plant materials. And so when we bring them into captivity, and again, the research shows that when we feed them mixes, they're going to consume less water. And this has significant disease implications. You know, chronic low-grade dehydration has been tied to many diseases, including renal disease, anemia. There's even potential correlation to dental disease and GI stasis, as well as one of the most common issues, which is bladder sludge or bladder stones. So ensuring these animals consistently intake the right amount of fiber and tie that to hydration is just truly essential to decreasing the likelihood of many of these common diseases.
Myth number 9 is that you can just train your pet not to selectively feed, encourage them to eat really everything that's in their bowl.
Yeah, and so as we've alluded to, you know, this is a survival mechanism. This is a hardwired trait. These animals aren't choosing to selectively feed, so this isn't something you can necessarily train them to not do. We know natural behavior will kind of trump anything we try to train them, so the best solution we have as pet parents is to simply feed them a product that's uniform in matrix so they cannot selectively feed.
So we've shared a lot of information with you, and we've referenced a lot of research studies. So to summarize really quickly here at the end, mixes really do contain too much starch and too little fiber to support the unique digestive tracts of small mammals.
Yeah, we also know that mixes stimulate and support that natural concentrate selecting behavior, and unfortunately, that leads them to reject some of the important things like the high fiber, nutritionally balanced with micronutrients mixes, and exacerbate some of those fiber and starch imbalances.
And we've also shown that feeding mixes can have implications even outside of this commercially available product. So that animals fed mixes actually consume less hay and drink less water compared to those fed uniform foods.
And some of the most common disease issues we see with digestive physiology, with GI stasis, dental disease, bladder sludge, and bladder stones, we know are directly tied to feeding mixes and the natural behaviors these animals have.
Yeah, and contrary to what you might read on a bag of mixes or hear or see on a website even, animals fed mixes actually spend less time feeding and are more inactive compared to animals fed a uniform food.
And while adding small amounts of hay and giving it the name of a foraging mix certainly seems nutritionally appropriate, the research actually shows us that that actually stimulates the animals to deselect ingesting hay and ingest less fiber, which is a very negative outcome.
And the selective feeding that really leads to a lot of these issues associated with mixes is hardwired into your pet and just cannot be conquered by any amount of training.
So we've shared a lot of information with you today, but just some of the real top level take homes are that we know that a lot of these Musi mixes, they look appealing, right? They look like they would be nutritionists, and a lot of times they're even cheaper at the cash register. The reality is though, is that by feeding them, you're gonna likely induce disease and potentially lead to more cost and more negative impacts on your animal's overall quality of life.
Yeah, and while they do look more natural and they have a variety of different looking components, and they say that they will stimulate foraging on the bag, the research just does not support this. The research shows that all of these claims are basically untrue and are not unhealthy for small mammals.
Yeah. So kind of tying it all together, feeding a uniform pellet as part of their overall nutritional profile is really the only way to ensure that your pet has the highest quality nutrition. We can avoid that selective feeding pattern and really gets the appropriate nutrition in every single bite.
All right, so hopefully everybody enjoyed that information. Again, Dr. Iske did an amazing job really digging into getting beyond kind of what the bag says and applying that to, not just a couple of papers, but literally dozens and dozens of papers that are in the literature. I know we had one question that came up, and hopefully we'll have some more. This question came from Becky Gimmons, and Becky asks, if customer comes in and says their vet told them their rabbit or guinea pig is overweight, maybe because of feeding a muesli mix, what is the best diet to offer? Should it be pellet and should it be hay? As a practicing veterinarian who sees a lot of rabbits and a lot of guinea pigs and a lot of overweight rabbits and guinea pigs, this is a question that I'm kind of faced with a lot, and it's certainly a very relevant one. The first thing to just remember is that when we're feeding rabbits and guinea pigs, we're really feeding the microbiome that's in their GI tract and in their hindgut. And as much as we can, as pet parents, say, I know what's good and what's bad and where I need to go, it's really important to be thoughtful in that process and in that timing because of the impact to the GI bacteria. So much like we talk about with dogs and cats, we never, ever want to switch right away or really abruptly, right? Even if we're going from a horrible diet with no hay to a better diet, that needs to be a process and needs to be a transition. And so usually what my recommendation is that owners look to make that overall transition over the course of almost a month, sometimes even longer. Sometimes it's easy to say, we want to change to be 3/4 of the old food, 1/4 of the new for a week, then half and half, then 3/4 new, 1/4 old, but some time of laid out pattern of change tied to volume that it makes it a little bit easier for the owner to kind of comprehend that. And if weight is an issue, my first goal is always to make that transition to a better food and then look more specifically at the caloric density of the food and start to begin to restrict that. So I'll always make the transition away from a muesli mix onto a uniform high fiber pellet while I'm introducing hays, if that needs to be the case, hopefully a diversity of hays. Sometimes you'll find they like orchard better than Timothy, but we want to offer orchard, Timothy, oat, Bermuda, or all the different diversities to get that diversity of grass hays. Make that transition 3 or 4 weeks while we're making the pellet, monitoring weight as you go. And then once they've made that transition, then start looking more specifically at the density in terms of calories of the pellet and begin to slowly back that off. more often than not, when you go from a muesli mix, which is higher caloric density, as Dr. Iske alluded to, fat, starch, simply moving them over to a uniform pellet that's high in fiber, that's going to shift that caloric intake enough that you may not have to do a lot more in terms of volume if you're feeding the amount. But then obviously you always need to keep treats in mind. A lot of people don't realize that, oh, I'm just feeding 1 or 2 yogurt drops a day. Well, what is yogurt? Nutritionally, that's sugar. So you're getting 2, 3, 4 times the amount of calories in a tiny little iota of a treat than you're getting from pellets. So obesity is an issue. It's not just a dog and a cat issue. And anytime I see an overweight rabbit or guinea pig, I can almost promise you that the microbiome that's in their hindgut is struggling a little bit as well. So Dr. Iske, I don't know if you would add anything to that. Feel free, but that'd be kind of my response.
Yeah, I think you covered it.
Great question. Do we have any other questions out there? Throw them in the chat box or in the Q&A session as well. Otherwise, I'm going to start asking Dr. Iske questions, and that won't be fun for anybody. Let's see here.
We did have a question earlier, and maybe Dr. Iske, this might be a good question for you. Of if someone has made the decision that they are going to purchase a uniform pellet, given that they all look the same, how does a store or a customer go about determining which one may be better or which one may be a more premium nutritious choice?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think no matter what pet you have, reading a pet food bag can be difficult for sure. So obviously the front of the bag is designed to catch your eye and be appealing and have your marketing claims, but I always go straight to the back of the bag to see, first of all, what are the ingredients in that food, and then what is in the guaranteed analysis, or what nutrients are they guaranteed for this bag of food. So obviously for small herbivores, fiber is king. So on your guaranteed analysis, you definitely want to make sure that you have a really good level of fiber. And in those graphs, we mentioned that kind of the minimum is somewhere around 15% or so, but really the higher the better. So we tried to stick around 20 to 25 or higher percent fiber. So for small herbivores, that's definitely the first place that I look, just to make sure that the fiber is there in that food. And then other things, of course, for rabbits and guinea pigs in particular, calcium is always a big one. So just making sure there's a balanced level of calcium. And if that is on the bag, just making sure it's in correct proportions with phosphorus. So just making sure the nutrients are there, but then where you can get an idea of really the quality of the food is by looking at the ingredient list. And it's really tempting to kind of just focus on the first 1 or 2 or 3 ingredients, but you really have to look at that overall to see what kind of quality you're getting and how it's balanced out. So with small herbivores, a Timothy hay or a grass hay based pellet is always going to be the best. Again, going back to that fiber, but then just making sure that, that there are high quality sources of protein and all of the minerals in there. So I know it's not a super easy read, but just going to the back of the bag, looking at the ingredient list and the guaranteed analysis and making sure that everything stacks up there.
Any other questions out there? That was another great question.
We'd actually received one more that the question was, could my customers supplement their mixed foods with vitamin supplements? Is that a good way for the animal to get the nutrients they might miss in a mixed diet?
I'm going to jump in and say definitely not. Vitamins and minerals, we refer to them as micronutrients because they're absolutely required in the diet, but they are needed in very small amounts. So when we start trying to kind of play around with a little bit of this and a little bit of that and adding that by hand, it can very quickly become counterproductive. So just as you can have a vitamin or a mineral deficiency, you can also have a toxicity. And without really knowing how much you're adding or what your animal needs, that is a very slippery slope that can lead to even more issues than a deficiency. So relying on your bag of food to already have those vitamins and minerals in there at the correct proportions is absolutely the best route, because at home, it's just really tricky to get those inclusions right.
Yeah, and I'll just tag on to that. I mean, that is spot on with that answer. Kind of even the next level is if you think about guinea pigs and vitamin C, right? We know the importance of vitamins and minerals on all these species, but then you've got a species that is uniquely reliant on the vitamin C in their diet. And so knowing vitamin C is not always a stable vitamin, and they need a certain amount. Too little, or to Dr. Iske's point, too much is not optimal. Now, it is water soluble, so they can urinate it out. But, we come from the time where a lot of clients were feeding a muesli mix, which leads to incomplete and inconsistent vitamin intake, and then coupling like a vitamin C supplement, a lot of times in the form of like an nosate, like a water drop. And that just, there's no way that you're going to get consistent intake. You're likely going to decrease the intake of water because of the impact to the actual flavor itself. And in a species that is so reliant on one micronutrient, adding that variability to it is just, again, setting us up for a problem. And in a prey species, they don't show us how they're really feeling. They're not communicating, oh, I'm a little low in vitamin C today. You're not going to see that until it's at a point where it's physiologically affected their body. And medically speaking, it really puts us kind of up a creek and not with a lot of opportunity to get that animal going the right direction. So focusing on something where you can verify the specific amount from macros to micros in every bite they take eliminates that uncertainty of toxicity or deficiency directly, like Dr. Iske alluded to.
I think we have another question coming through asking about variety and how to offer variety correctly if it's not coming from these mixes. And one of the biggest kind of pushbacks that at least I've heard to a uniform pellet is that they look boring and they look uninteresting. And the reason, again, why people pick muesli mixes is that it seems like that is the right variety that you want to be offering these pets. But I think, in the video, we highlighted why mixes aren't the right way. But to talk about really what is the right way to offer variety, I definitely go to offering different kinds of hay. And it might not seem like a bag of hay is very different than the next, or that orchard is very different from Timothy. But the characteristics that your pet can sense go way beyond what we can. So orchard and Timothy have a different aroma, have a different flavor, have a little bit of a different texture, and that all provides variety depending on what kind of hay that you're offering. So just changing that up, not only what you're feeding, but how you're feeding it. So rather than just putting a handful of hay in the cage and letting it be right there, you can spread it around. You can get different kinds of enrichment as far as putting hay in a feeder or scattering around or something like that. And there's tons and tons of different ways to change the way that you offer food beyond just the food that you offer. And I think greens and veggies are another huge opportunity, in my opinion. You go to the grocery store and you look around and see how many different kinds of fruits and vegetables and produce. While they're not all appropriate for small mammals, there's a huge number of greens and veggies that you can rotate through, see what your pet likes, what they don't like, and just almost come up with like a weekly schedule to get a ton of variety into the diet. So I think the other dietary items besides a pelleted diet are definitely the way that you offer that variety and enrichment to your pet.
Our goal should always be to mimic natural behavior and natural nutrition. And just like Dr. Iske alluded to, it's not only fun for the animal, it's not only a great way to kind of engage with your animal, but it really ties back to those natural behaviors and stimulating them to be physically active, mentally stimulated. Because if they're not doing that, what are they doing? They're sitting in the corner of their cage doing nothing. Great question. Any other questions? So here's another one. This just says, what about foraging? How do you do that the right way? Dr. Iske, feeling tempted? You want me to roll with it? I like your answers. You go with it.
Yeah, mine again just kind of goes back to the way that you're offering your food. So rather than just putting pellets in a bowl and putting that in front of your pet, sprinkle them around the cage, sprinkle them around whatever area they have access to, and make them really go foraging for those high value items. And the same goes for hay. Hide treats inside of that hay, put the hay in a slow feeder or something that they have to physically manipulate to get to. Basically just make it harder for them to eat. Kind of sounds weird, but make them use their muscles and their get to food in different ways. I think is a great way to start, and it can be something as simple as putting hay in a toilet paper roll and making them kind of get in there and just go from there. I've seen a lot of small animal owners get really, really creative. And I think the sky is kind of the limit with that. But any way that you can offer in a new and unique way, I think is the right way to do foraging, while you're always still controlling exactly what they're eating, but allowing them different ways to go about eating that food.
And all of that ties directly to in their habitat, as Dr. Iske alluded to, and outside of their habitat. One of the best places to get that enrichment is to get them outside that little ecosystem that is mostly their world. Take them into a larger room where it's kind of bunny proofed, and they just have simply more geographical space, not only horizontal, but rabbits love perching up on things. Guinea pigs will go up on things. And then take all of those ideas that Dr. Iske alluded to, toilet paper rolls and hiding things, and then just disperse that across a bigger area and force them to work for it, whether that's treats or even do that, with the diet. I mean, far too often, not just with rabbits. I mean, it's the same problem in birds. Like, here's 90% of your calories in a bowl that you can inhale in 15 seconds, and then you're done for the day. So slow that process down. And that will naturally stimulate those behaviors that are associated with foraging. I don't know. Those are some good questions. We're on a roll. Let's see if we get any more. All right. Well, certainly this is not a one and done opportunity. If you have any other questions, we're going to be doing this again tomorrow. Feel free to just email questions in. We'd love to follow up with everybody. We're also happy to share any information relevant to this presentation. So if this is information you could take back to your teams, if you can use this for internal trainings or even sharing with some of those customers that are really driving for that additional level of education, we're certainly more than happy to share any component of this presentation and literature and the research that we've done associated with it. I do think we have a little bit of a drawing now. Lindsay, I don't know if that's something you want to take over and handle.
Sure. I will echo what Cayla and our Dr. Iske and Dr. Kohles said here today, in giving gratitude for you guys attending and participating in the session. Hopefully it was an educational opportunity and something you can take back and share with pet owners at your retailer location.